any questions you have or thoughts you want to offer?
I kind of had a question. When I was reading the articles, you like mentioned some stuff about like kind of patient teaching around like what to expect when you're gonna have a premature child, and how like parents like in the heat of the moment and like you're very scared, not knowing what's gonna happen, it's hard to make informed decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do you think that it would be beneficial to include like teaching around that in all just like prenatal like counseling kind of, or is that just too early to even talk about that?
Well, babies who are born in the gray zone, where you could withhold treatment, are so rare that I don't actually think that would be productive. So to give it to 100% of parents when something like 0.2% are going to go through this process, I don't think that's a good idea. What I do think would be a good idea, that I talked about with some of the doctors, is like a binder of testimonials of just, of a parent explaining what they went through and how they view their child's quality of life now, a couple of years later, and what I think would be most wonderful is you could have a parent educator there to talk with the parents. That's also probably impractical. The March of Dimes had somebody who could be there once every 2 weeks, and as a parent, mentor. But I don't think that having that person on call in antepartum when everything gets crazy is really practical. So I do think, I think you're right. More parental education of the patient of what this involves and what's happening here would be meaningful. Mm-hmm. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you talked about kind of the confusion surrounding moderate to severe and severe to profound neurodevelopmental disease, and did they like leave out what that all entailed? Like, would it have been more helpful to like break it down instead of just using those words?
Yeah, they did leave out what that entailed, and so they didn't entirely. They talked about things like cerebral palsy, blindness, deafness, but they didn't really talk about what would have helped us is to say some children in this category have a hard time learning to walk, and they maybe they learn to walk a year late, maybe, or their language remains severely impaired throughout their childhood, and they never catch up. Or to be more stark, they never learn to stand, they never learn to communicate.
Right.
You're left having some questions. How much of a sense of self do they even have? Mm-hmm. And those are those qualitative aspects are something that that was lacking, and that would have really helped to make an informed decision. As it was, we were just going to dig in our heels and say no to everything. And as glad as I am we saved Gabriel, at the same time there are some situations in which you do have to say, you shouldn't do all these extraordinary measures for the child. And if we had believed that Gabriel would live in a state of extreme ongoing suffering and pain, that's the sort of thing we would have thought about withholding treatment. But they didn't talk about that. They talked about disability as being the reason to withhold treatment, and so it's like, well, are they going to? Is it because we have something against the disabled? Is that why we should give up? Is it we're going to be unsatisfied customers if we come home with a disabled kid? Is that what they're trying to prevent? So, Other questions, or you can go first.
Well, this was two questions wrapped into one,
Okay.
and I feel like you already addressed this, but just for clarification, at the time that you were making the decision, do you feel like the decision you made was fully informed?
Boy, that's a complicated question. Well, it was, I suppose it was fully informed in the sense of, they did explain to us all of the things they were going to do to try, if they provided resuscitation. And they explained to us that it went way beyond normal CPR, and that they were going to have to give him drugs to get his heart rate up and things like that. And so, yeah, that we were informed in that sense. To have a, to have an understanding of what actually, what actual kind of life preemies have, they didn't really try to provide information on that. So in that sense, I guess I wasn't informed. So, and then what's the second half of the question?
Well, no, there's three, but they're all related, so you can probably knock them out in one answer. So you're saying that it wasn't fully informed in the sense that you didn't really know what to expect if this baby did live, and you knew the statistics and all of that, but you didn't really know what that would look like. So in that case, what do you think that the doctors and the hospital could have done to make your decision more fully informed? And then what more could the nurses have done? In particular, the nurses' role.
Okay. Well, I think some qualitative rather than quantitative information would have made a big difference towards getting us towards informed consent. And also just a more personal kind of conversation about what kinds of value system that we had versus what kind of values they were trying to follow in their decision making of whether to provide or withhold treatment.
So you feel like they didn't really understand you or try to understand you?
That's right.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now at the time we didn't really even have the vocabulary to have that conversation, which is one of the reasons we're promoting these additional questions that we think the doctors should ask, is to stimulate this conversation so that they can get to that kind of closer to informed consent. And then as for the the nurses, I guess we didn't have that many conversations with nurses during that time. I got the impression that the nurses were talking to the doctors about, here's how this family is doing before we had the conferences on what to do about treatment. But one is, I suppose what nurses can do is just to get to know the family a little bit better. And during all of the various times you get to talk with them about what it is they want, what it is they're looking for. And then when you have a doctor who starts talking about disability, and but you happen to know that the family cares more about quality of life and than they do about whether their child is disabled, or vice versa, you can steer the doctor towards the values that the parents have explained to you are their most important ones. Because it's easy for the doctor to start the conversation the way he's had it with other families who go through this, or with the way he learned it in a textbook or at a conference, but then you happen to know that the family's interests are different than what he thinks or she thinks she's talking about.
So the nurses could have made should make more of an effort to understand the families and build that relationship, and that way they can mediate better between the doctor and the family.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, you had something.
I was just going to ask what this experience's impact had on your faith, the impact of this experience on your faith.
Oh boy. Well, one aspect of it was it kind of upset my understanding of what a good person is and what a good person ought to get. To say, well, it's like, I'm like, well, God, I know I've been against abortion for years, so why are we having this thing happen to us that we're being asked to do that's so similar to an abortion? And I was really angry about that for a while. And, it's this understanding that I've came to realize as time went on that, nobody has a get out of temptation free card in this life. And that you might be pushed and tested in a way that you really don't think you should be tested, and that is just part of the Christian life, and you can't get out of it. You can cry all you like about it. And then it's the other thing that it has taught me, I guess, is about the importance of intercession and intercessory prayer, asking people to pray for you. I, for one, am actually pretty bad at that. When somebody says, "Oh, pray for me, my mother's sick," blah, 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 and then by the nighttime, when it's actually time to say the evening prayer, I don't do that. I forget, and so you get a sense of the thousands of people who are praying for your child as the word goes around the church network that you have in our case, the Diocese of the West. It's this humbling experience. Other questions?
Oh, yeah. One of our articles that we read was on social context of whether or not you should resuscitate an infant, a premature infant. So, I just wanted to know what your take on that was. How social context plays into that decision. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, the experiences of a family and the values that they hold and the social context in which they live makes a huge difference as to whether they want to do that. There are some parents who, given the opportunity to step away from a severely disabled child, would do so and say, well, let's try again next time. And this is going to be like a miscarriage. We'll be sad about it, but that this is what we want. Other parents would want everything possible to be done because of their faith, because of maybe their family. Maybe they have a mentally disabled person in their family that they grew up with, and they simply couldn't bear the thought of, we preserved my sister, why are we going to now walk away from my son, sort of an aspect. And yet it takes, when you've got somebody who's just checked into the hospital and their lives are in total crisis, it takes quite a while as nurses and doctors to figure out what kind of context that person is coming from. A book I'd recommend you read is called This Lovely Life. It's by I think her name is Vicki Foreman or Corman or something close to that. But it's by a preemie mom who had twins in California around 1999 or 2000. And they were 24-weekers, had all sorts of problems, and the doctor said, we're gonna resuscitate no matter what, and we're gonna resuscitate even against your consent, without your consent, and that's what they did. And so it's this evolution of her being against resuscitation, and then eventually coming around to realizing that she is now in favor of it, and it talks about her social context, and it's the emotional presence of this book is just astonishing. It's going to knock you over several times as you go through it, and it's really good. Other questions?
Eric, it's always, I always learn something new when you come, and I really appreciate your willingness to come and share, and keep it up with the videos. Does your son know he's a star and famous?
You know, he is getting, he's starting to get some awareness that there was some things that were different about his birth. And it is all, it's actually mostly centered around his G-tube, which he still has. You know, he'll ask us questions like, why can't I chew? And I'll say, well, most people learn to chew when they're 1 year old, and you weren't able to drink at that point because you didn't learn to drink when you were a tiny little baby. And so he sees the pictures of him with all the tubes, and he realizes that he spent a longer time in the hospital than other children did. Yeah, he's not aware of. I don't think he's aware that I come to these events and talk about him. So, and that is kind of and also something I kind of worry about as he gets, later on, because I don't want to, turn him into like Harry Potter, the boy who lived. So,
have you noticed a difference at all? I know it's still early in his school career, but has he? And I thought about this when you talked about him slurping down his yogurt drink so quickly. Has he shown any marked changes since he's been around other kids that influence, typically developing kids who are chewing? And have you noticed anything yet with him being in school?
Well, I mean, he's been in a school setting for 2.5 years now. And he will come home and talk about things he saw other children doing, and ask why it is he's not doing them, and sometimes I'll say, well, we can work on that when we get to therapy this week, and he hasn't shown any real sense of sadness over being left out or anything like that. So
that's good.
Yes.
So you mentioned this, it's scattered here and there, but it sounds like you're using some resources for your son. You mentioned nephrology. What other resources are you using just as your son continues to?
Oh, yeah, we have a nephrologist we see once a year. She does a kidneys ultrasound on him and a urine test to make sure he's okay. We have a gastroenterologist we see once every 2 or 3 months, and they're both monitoring the G-tube and his weight, just to make sure he's gaining enough weight. And he does have some GI issues with getting constipated and needing to be given huge amounts of laxative once a month, which is, believe me, unpleasant. And we have a speech therapist that we see to deal with the chewing and drinking issues. He did have motor delays, and we were seeing physical therapists about that, but he seems to be caught up enough that it's not an ongoing issue. Yes.
And regarding the tube that he has, and also the chewing, do they have any idea if the tube, is that going to be a lifelong thing for him, or?
Probably not.
Okay.
When they talked us into the tube, they said, "Oh, you can take it out in a few months because he'll learn to drink on his own." And, well, maybe that happens with some kids, but not ours. He is slowly, very, very, very slowly, you can't even use the word baby step to describe it, advancing in his ability to drink, in his ability to chew. We have no idea when he's going to get there, but one of the things about a gastric tube is it's really quite easy to take out when you're done with it, and then the hole just heals up in a couple days, and then you can't ever go back at that point unless you want to have a new surgery. I'd love to get to that point someday, but right now we're still at the point where You know, yeah, he doesn't chew anything. He gets very bossy about which restaurant we go to. But the thing is, what he really wants is is the Pizza Hut in Puyallup, in downtown Puyallup, that's right next to the train tracks, that has a train go by 3 times an hour. He won't touch the food at the Pizza Hut.
But I hope you like pizza.
Oh yeah, we're okay. We like the pizza. Yeah.
Well, I think we've come to the end of our session, but thank you again for
Thank you
coming.
for having me.
Thank you. And thank you for just bringing your stories.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
great.
Keep in touch with me.